Good morning, Emmanuelers. Hope you're doing okay. Hope you'll forgive me for leading you astray yesterday. But today's daily devotion, we're going straight in, doing it properly, and I hope this encourages you. We're at the end of Luke chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10. When I read through this passage, I guess one of the main things that stood out to me was the many contrasts that we see in this passage. I guess conflicting ideas or surprising things. Firstly, we have Jesus entering a village, and right the way through the Gospels we see Jesus going to different places, and so often he is received warmly and crowds gather and that sort of thing. But this is surprising in that he's not received. Then it goes into a passage where Jesus underlines, I suppose, the cost of following him. Jesus has given a wide invitation to follow him, and indeed one person says, I will follow you wherever you go. But then it goes on and other people sort of give excuses. So there's a wide invitation to follow Jesus, but a mixed response. That's another contrast. As we get into chapter 10, we see Jesus sending out 72, the wider circle of disciples, I suppose. And in doing that, Jesus gives a couple of, I suppose, illustrations or analogies of what is happening. And in one of them is incredibly encouraging. He's sending them out to share the news of the kingdom. And he says, the harvest is plentiful. And so that's, in one sense, a real word of encouragement to. He's sending out his followers and saying, speak to people of the kingdom. The harvest is plentiful. Yes, there's only a few workers, but there's a plentiful harvest out there. There's something to be reaped in terms of sharing this good news with people and seeing them respond and come to God as a result. So in one hand, it's incredibly encouraging. But the other analogy that Jesus uses in this exercise is also to say, but also you are lambs amongst wolves. That doesn't quite sound as encouraging and as positive. I guess that's a word of warning. And then he goes on to explain that some places might not receive you warmly. Even though you have good news to share, expect hostility. And we, as I've said, have seen that even in Jesus' ministry as well. So we have these contrasts of sort of an encouraging word to go out and share the words of the kingdom, but also a caution and an expectation of opposition and hostility. And then right at the end of the passage that we're looking at today, there's also a note of judgment. Jesus refers to the destruction of Sodom from the book of Genesis. And it's interesting because that contrasts with what Jesus, in at the beginning of this passage, his response to James and John, who say to him, in that the town that has not accepted Jesus, they say to him, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? And Jesus says no. And so on the one hand, Jesus says no, the fire from heaven is not coming, but then a few verses later, Jesus is referring to Sodom, and in Genesis, literally fire from heaven is what happened to destroy that town. So there's sort of patience towards judgment, but there's also the reality of judgment. So we've got lots of these contrasts running right the way through this passage, and I suppose it made the verse that sprung to mind to bring all these threads together, I suppose, is found in Romans chapter 11 and verse 22, where it says, then note that then the kindness and the severity of God. And we see both of those things in this passage. We see the encouraging kingdom gospel sharing initiative, and Jesus saying, follow me whoever you are, there's good news I want to share to you. But there's also references to the judgment of God as well. So what does this mean for us? Well, firstly, we need to stop and we need to recognize, when we consider the kindness and severity of God, that without Christ himself, each one of us would only be receiving the severity of God because of our sin. The severe judgment of God has been completely taken from you in Christ. God is a God of justice. You and I are guilty of sin. And that would only end in us receiving the severity of God. But for Christ. Christ has stepped in. Christ has died for us. And Christ on the cross receives this severity of the justice and judgment of God in our place for our sin, so that we can receive the kindness of God. And so if you're ever wondering, is God judging me? Is he severe towards me? If your faith is in Christ, that has been completely taken away, completely satisfied at the cross. Jesus says, it is finished. And so that severity has been taken so that we can just be recipients of the kindness of God. God is kind to us through Jesus Christ. But that's for us personally, but these ideas of kindness and severity should also provoke us in our, as this passage calls us to do, praying earnestly, and also going out and seeing ourselves as sent people with the gospel in our hearts to witness to others, to point to others, to say, actually, you need to receive the kindness of God in Christ. Otherwise, you will only receive the judgment, the severe and just judgment of God in death. And we have great encouragement from this passage. There's a harvest. God says there is a harvest to be reaped. There is a bringing in of people into the kingdom that needs to happen and will happen right now, because God is doing it. He's sending out laborers into this harvest. But at the same time, it won't be easy. We are lambs amongst wolves. We live in a hostile society. A society hostile to God, hostile to Christ, hostile to even truth and his light that he sheds onto the way we live our lives. But we must take encouragement. The kindness of God is with us in Christ. Let's share that kindness of God and grace of God with others today.